Hi, this is Paul. One of the interesting stories that came up at the end of November was this one, which was a religious survey in the UK, shifting religious makeup in England and Wales. According to the latest census, the number of Christians dropped from 33 million to 27 million, less than half the population in the past decade. So Christians in the number of people who checked off the box Christian in 2011 was almost 60%, and that dropped to 46.2%. No religion, no religion went from 25% to 37%. Now, when this thing came up, I didn't actually pay a lot of attention to it. I thought it was rather interesting, but it certainly got a lot of press. Christianity Today had a pretty good article. I was checking out The Rest is History. Now, if you're a member of the Rest is History Club, you get access to a once a month live stream that they do, which, of course, for those of you who are familiar with the internet, is pretty common stuff. The Rest is History is always sort of on audio podcast alone, but the live stream is on YouTube. And again, you won't find this in the regular stream. You have to, in fact, join the Rest is History Club. So there you go, Tom and Dom. Yeah, I've given you a little bit of free promotion here. So what was interesting was that there were actually a lot of interesting tidbits in this particular live stream from The Rest is History. Now, I don't usually like I don't think this violates the spirit of that live stream, because it came up and I thought Tom Holland's comments on this were very, very interesting.
There's always, I mean, as we often say in certainly the bonus podcast, there's always the shadow of the golf club, isn't there? Whenever we get off the facts and we get onto
we start ranting about things we don't really
so
know
talking
about.
of the shadow of the golf club, Tom, this would interest you. A big story in Britain in the last few weeks, or certainly the last week or so, and I don't know how many of our international listeners will be interested in this or not, but maybe they'll have resonances in their own country. The results of the latest census for 10 years in Britain have been published, and for the first time, less than half of the population of England and Wales had described themselves as Christian. And so, as Brown says on I think on the Discord, Tom Holland, and yet. So, Tom, does this matter? I mean, a lot of people, the newspaper coverage is that, this is a seismic moment. This is obviously it's a development of long trends, but is it a big change?
I think it does matter to the degree that the argument that I've been making is that people who would define themselves as atheist or humanist are essentially Christian in their assumptions. And I won't go into that because I've talked about it, God knows how often. But when I looked at the statistics, what I found interesting was that the number of humanists and self-defined atheists has gone down as well. So in a sense,
to your ears, you hate humanists.
No, I don't. I would have defined myself.
They hate you.
Humanist.
Sorry, I got it wrong. Yes, they hate you.
Yeah, they do hate me.
Now, if I had just seen this video before I saw the next video I'm going to show, I would have thought, what humanists don't love Tom Holland? Well, apparently there are some critics to Tom Holland's position, but let's let these two finish, because Tom makes the point again that, but the number of, let's see what he says again. I'm still trying to readjust my little setup here to sort of get things right.
People who would define themselves as atheist or humanist are essentially Christian in their assumption. I think
this is obviously it's a development of long trends, but is it a big change?
I think it does matter to the degree that the argument that I've been making is that people who would define themselves as atheist or humanist are essentially Christian in their assumptions. And I won't go into that because I've talked about it, God knows how often. But when I looked at the statistics, what I found interesting was that the number of humanists and self-defined atheists has gone down as well.
And that's what's fascinating, because of course the whole premise for a long time has been, well, with the with the recession of Christianity, atheism is going to supplant it. And of course, if you look at, if you look at this, well, no. Islam rose, Hinduism rose, Jews stayed the same. Sorry, Jews. Sikhs rose, Buddhists rose slightly, other rose, not answered went down. Well, that's interesting. And of course, these surveys, it's sort of hard to know, but very, very interesting. So a little bit of interpretation.
So in a sense,
to your ears, you hate humanists.
No, I don't. I would have defined myself.
They hate
as
you.
Humanist. They
Sorry, I
do
got it
hate
wrong.
me.
They hate you.
Yeah, they do hate
you.
me. So I thought that I was surprised by that, because I'd assumed that to a degree that the people who cared enough not to define themselves as Christian that was such an important part of their identity that they would define themselves as atheist or humanist. But they're not doing that. And I think that I think that atheism, or kind of Richard Dawkins type evangelical atheism, I've said it again and again, I think that is a kind of Christianity. That is fake.
Okay. Evangelical atheism. I love how he put those two things together. And again, he says, well, that's really a religion.
In that. And I think that I think that atheism, or kind of Richard Dawkins type evangelical atheism, I've said it again and again, I think that is a kind of Christianity. That is fading along with Christian identity.
Now, there's a tremendous amount of irony there. If you had told the new atheists, a decade ago, that their war would be counterproductive to their own cause, because one way or another they're tied to the Christian ship, I don't think they'd be happy, but that seems to be what's happening.
Which I think proves my point to a degree.
Tim Vasby
so the difference,
he's exulting. I can look at him in the chat. He's exulting at there.
But so I think that what is happening is not that people are necessarily hostile to Christianity or to institutional religion or anything like that. It's just that they don't care. They know literally nothing about it. And I do think that the fading of a basic understanding, say, of biblical stories, or what bishops are, or this kind of pretty basic stuff that for most of the history of Britain people have been able to take for granted, I do think that is massive, and I don't quite know how it will play out. But I think one way in which it might play out.
Now what's interesting is that if you go back a little while, you can find Richard Dawkins making the same lament. And when I was in the UK, obviously I was only in for a short time. I didn't talk to everybody in the UK, obviously, but the point that Tom Holland just made was made to me by a number of clergy in the UK, just talking about the absolute ignorance of Christianity or Christian history. This especially in a nation where, in many ways, the religious establishment, if they would care to employ it, would have potentially a great amount of positional power to educate on this score. And it simply hasn't happened. And many of the people that I've spoken with from the UK, even that had compulsory chapel or some of these things in the particular school that they went to, left with very little. I spoke with some people that I would have imagined, by virtue of the kinds of things they do, that they themselves would have a decent amount of knowledge of Christianity. And in a couple of conversations, I didn't say anything, or I didn't drop my jaw or anything like that, but and I'm certainly not talking about Tom Holland here, but in a couple of conversations, I was frankly shocked that what I think I got to be careful here, because I've had many conversations with Americans who, when they'd say, oh, what kind of, part of the reason Livingstone's Church changed its name from Sacramento Christian Reformed Church to Livingstone's Church after I got here was I was tired of people, of course, the churches in Sacramento, so they'd mentally jump over that. And then they'd see Christian Reformed. They'd jump over Christian because it was a church and there's a cross on the outside. Then they'd see Reformed and they'd say, what's that? Is that like Reformed school? And, you get that question all the time. So, yeah, Americans have a lot of ignorance too. And then if I would say Protestant, blank. Bible, bing. Oh, Bible, okay. Baptist, no, we're not Baptist. Non-denominational, we're not non-denominational. Christian Reform, is that a denomination? I don't know. Anyway, back to the story. So they've got a real point there, but this sense of humanism and Christianity being wed, and in the past I've talked about secularity as sort of the secret sister of the church. And I mean, that's Tom Holland's thesis, and I think he's dead on right.
Out is that Atlantic stuff that for most of the history of Britain, people have been able to take for granted. I do think that is massive, and I don't quite know how it will play out. But I think one way in which it might play out is that people will take and run Christian ideas, and they will start to kind of mutate and take on increasingly, from a Christian perspective, kind of slightly strange.
This is your thesis about wokeism,
phenomena,
isn't it? The wokeism is Christianity, kind of. So Mary Kirk-Alvarez
and communism. And if you listen to how many episodes of The Rest is History, you will see that, again, Tom's thesis, and I think he's dead on right. Tom is right that Christianity was so utterly pervasive that many of the movements of the last few centuries, even those that had become ostensibly anti-Christian, like Marxism, New Atheism, in many ways, they're just simply deeply Christian in a certain way. The assumptions are Christian, the formation is Christian. And so, ironically, with the kind of decline of Christianity and the kind of Christianity, it also means the decline of atheism and humanism. I'll just let him finish up here.
That's a very good question. What do people say they are then? Now, I think what's happened actually is that people,
religion, I think they say.
They would say no religion. Now, I think what's happened.
Now, if you look at the survey, in fact, no religion rose, quite a bit. And so that was their answer. Not humanism, not atheism. And so, much to the chagrin of how many atheists, kind of sounds like a religion, at least to people taking the survey. Oh, I really got to get all this kind of stuff sorted down.
Happened here, Mary Kirk, is this. I think what's actually happened is that the level of religious observance in Britain has declined gradually certainly over our lifetime. But what has changed is that people who once would have ticked the box that they regarded as the default, which was Church of England. Yeah. Which people didn't tick it because they went to services. They ticked it because they thought, I'm a patriotic, normal person. So C of E is the obvious.
Christian nationalism?
Ticked it, which was Church of England. Yeah. Which people didn't tick it because they went to services. They ticked it because they thought, I'm a patriotic, normal person. So C of E is the obvious. I mean, that was the sort of default. Now what's happened is the people who tick that box are the people who actually go.
Now, if you actually look at the number of people who actually go, the people who tick that box might have gone at some point in their life a handful of times, because if you go to a channel like Ready for Harvest,
Church of England, the source of Anglicanism. The influence of the church has been massive. After the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, Anglicanism is the next largest communion worldwide, with 85 million people counted among the Anglican denominations. And of those 85 million people, 26 million are in the namesake church itself. That's right, 26 million baptized members of the Church of England. And there's
that's a massive number.
16,000 church buildings throughout England to accommodate them, although there's only 12,500 active parishes. And we're just talking England too, not the whole UK, because in Scotland it's a separate church, the Scottish Episcopal Church, and the church in Wales is also separate, along with the Church of Ireland, which services Northern Ireland. So 12,500 parishes in England for the 26 million members. That's 2,080 members per church on average. So the church is booming, right? Well, here's the bad news. Almost everyone doesn't show up. Yes, they're members officially, but in reality the Church of England has seen much better days. We're going to take a look at...
Now part of this is, I think part of perhaps what this survey showed was loss of mind share, loss of identity. They lost even sufficient traction to bring people in, obviously, a while ago.
At the 2019 statistics, and they aren't good news. And this is before the COVID-19 pandemic. When things are back to normal, we can revisit and see what additional damage has been done. Let's start with the median church. Take the church right in the middle, the 6,250th by size out of 12,500. How many people do you think are in attendance on a given week? There's around 6,000 churches bigger than this one and 6,000 churches smaller than it. Well, here's the answer. That church has an average weekly attendance of 31 people. You heard me right. 6,250 of the congregations in the mighty Church of England have 31 or fewer people in average weekly attendance. And how about the number of children in attendance in the median church, where 6,250 churches have more children and 6,250 have fewer? There's 2 children in that church. Half of Church of England congregations have 2 or fewer children. That's who will be attending in the next generation. In other words, nobody will be attending in the next generation in all likelihood. That's reflected in the bottom 25% of churches, which report an average of 0 children in attendance. Fewer than 1 out of 10 babies born in England are baptized into the church. And when asked their religion, the British Social Attitude Survey found for those over age 75, 33% of UK residents said they were Anglican, while for those between 18 and 24, the amount who claimed Anglican was just 1%. The median church sees 1 marriage or service of prayer and dedication each year and 4 funerals. That's a decrease in marriages or services of prayer and dedications over the decade since 2009 of 42%. And is it good news that funerals are down 31%? Or is it just the fact that when you have fewer people, there's fewer to die? Here's the reality. Though there are 26 million members out of the England population of 56 million, only 854,000 people attend in a given week. 7 years ago, in 2015, former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, warned that unless there was a major shift, the church was just 1 generation away from extinction. 75% of churches have 74 or fewer people in weekly attendance, and churches with 185 people are in the top 5%. Since 1990, every diocese in the church has declined, with one bright exception, that of London. David Goodhue, vicar of St. Barnabas Church in Middlesbrough, says of this, "London stands out. It has grown when every other Church of England diocese has shrunk. Some dioceses, like Manchester and Bath and Wells, have nearly halved in the last 30 years. Some have shrunk, but by only 20 to 30%, like Ely and Southwark. Indeed, London is the only Anglican diocese in either the USA or England to have grown in the last 30 years. You do not need to be Albert Einstein to see that based on pre-COVID trends, in another 30 years, some Church of England dioceses will cease to exist." Many reasons have been given for the decline, but an interesting comparison point is made by Goodhue, looking at other churches in the UK and seeing which ones are growing and which ones are shrinking. In the 3 decades from 1990 to 2019, Orthodox Church membership went from 185,000 to 475,000. Pentecostalism grew from 147,000 to 380,000. Methodists declined from 447,000 to 186,000, and Presbyterians went from 1.24 million to 622,000. Goodhue says, the primary common denominator is theology. Those trimming faith to fit in with culture have tended to shrink, and those offering a full-fat faith, vividly supernatural, have tended to grow. This is as true of the ultra-liturgical Orthodox as it is of the ultra-informal Pentecostals. He then adds another.
In other words, steep slope religion is growing.
The default is to say, I don't think about it, I'm not interested. And that was the sort of default. Now what's happened is the people who tick that box are the people who actually go, and the default is to say, I don't think about it, I'm not interested.
Yeah,
don't you think, Tom?
True.
I mean, I think
yeah,
that's
I do think that. But I think also that not believing in it is which had always been a strong marker of identity and was a kind of tribute to how significant it remained, that's fading now as well. I think if you care, if you're perturbed and angry enough about Christianity to define yourself against it, that's a tribute to the cultural hold that Christianity has.
Yeah.
I think if you simply don't care because it doesn't even intrude on your thoughts, then that's a much, much bigger reflection of its fading.
Yeah.
And that's also in the full fat phrase from the Ready to Harvest video, that, well, there's just less of it around, and so I'm not an atheist, I'm not a Christian, I'm just me.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. All right.
So that's the end of that section. Now Nate Heil on Twitter sent me this video, and I found it absolutely fascinating. Now, I had Mark Vernon on the channel quite a while ago when he had written his book. It's the title of the book, Secret History of Christianity. Interesting book. And he often does these chats with Rupert Sheldrake. And Sheldrake is... Sheldrake is one of the most interesting people on the internet for me. Sheldrake is just fascinating. And they have a bone to pick with Tom Holland.
My name is Mark Vernon, and I am with Rupert Sheldrake for another one of our dialogues. Hi there, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
These are conversations that we have, sparked by things we've been reading. Or
It's so British. Hello, Mark. Everyone is so calm, unlike some crazy Calvinist in California with a big beard.
Thinking about or experiencing, and hoping very much that by listening in, it sparks your own thoughts and maybe even other conversations as well. And today, Rupert, we just thought we would talk about the work of the historian Tom Holland, particularly because he has just published an essay, which was a talk given to Theos, the think tank, about humanism, and particularly how atheism...
And you can find, playing around with a standing desk, I could put this up and do this standing up. You can find that lecture on, let's see if the camera's high enough. Or how about the mic? I shouldn't I shouldn't play around with my studio when I'm doing this. You can find that on YouTube.
Theistic secular humanism, the sort that dominates the minds today, I guess, the kind of culture today, is a kind of Christian heresy, Holland argues. And this is a conclusion he's reached following his most recent successful book called Dominion, which is an examination of Christian history. And if I outline the argument very briefly, then Rupert, maybe you can develop it as well. But broadly speaking, as I've understood it, what Holland is suggesting is that the values most closely associated with humanism today, particularly human dignity, human equality, the sense that everybody has rights, the right to vote, the right of freedom, the valuing of the individual. He argues that that is through and through a Christian value, that it's not at all self-evident is the case without the deep ways that Christianity has shaped particularly the West. And so he argues you don't see that automatically as an assumption elsewhere in the world, where individual rights can be, pushed to one side. And also, it wasn't the case in the ancient world. It took Christianity to seed and then develop and then finally spread throughout the Western world, that sense of the importance of the individual. And so when atheistic humanists write out the Christian element in their inheritance. They're like the heretics who are trying to destroy the place that they've actually come from. So, Rupert, does that make
and of course, in Tom Holland's take on the survey, that's exactly Holland's point, that they've been cutting the branch that they're sitting on, and so as the Christians lose numbers, they lose numbers.
sense to you? Is that kind of what you
Yes.
feel he's saying?
Yes, I think personally, I find his argument that the whole concept of human rights and equality, um, it's at least equality before the law and equality of voting and so forth. Um, I find it very convincing that that comes out of the Christian tradition. I mean, Enlightenment rationalists like to think that it's an Enlightenment rationalist position. But I mean, where did that come from? Enlightenment rationalism looks back to ancient Greece and Rome, but ancient Greece and Rome were slave-owning societies who certainly didn't believe everyone had an equal right. And the kind of democracy they had in Athens, it was only confined to citizens, and only some citizens at that. So the origins of this concept, which is so important in the modern world, I find it very convincing that those come out of taking further tendencies already present in the Christian tradition. And I think that's what underlies a lot of wokeness, for example, the idea that everyone should be included, whatever their sexual proclivities, whatever their gender, etc., or choice of gender, whatever their race or cultural background or wealth or poverty. That inclusiveness, which is so much part of modern secular humanistic human rights approach, is very, very all-pervasive. It's more all-pervasive than it was in more Christian societies. But it's the same thing, in my view, taken further. And I think another point he makes is that that in taking over that aspect of the Christian tradition, secular humanists have also taken over another aspect, which is a kind of evangelical aspect, that they have to spread the word and bring those who are in darkness into light. So they have to enlighten people. So that's why you get groups like the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, campaigning skeptical groups who see it as their job, and Richard Dawkins, of course, to stamp out superstition, to liberate people into the light of science and reason. So it's a kind of Christian evangelical, a secularized form of Christian evangelical zeal.
And so again, that's exactly Holland's point, that they're bound together, these groups, and it's in fact very much John Vervaeke's point that in many ways a lot of these new atheists are just simply Protestants who have just continued to trek over the hill all the way to the other side.
And I think that rather more than just Christian is Protestant. I think that the roots of this are much more Protestant than Catholic, and wokeness and all these modern manifestations of an evangelical campaigning for human rights are much more common in Protestant Western Europe and in Protestant North America than they are in Southern Europe or Eastern Europe or South America, and certainly more than they are in India or China or Africa. So I think he makes a pretty persuasive case.
So now Mark's going to have his retort.
I'm a bit more skeptical for two reasons, really. One is I wonder about the simplification of the history, which is quite a strong thing to say to one of the most celebrated critical historians in the UK. But that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is the way that it's been received by Christians, which deeply worries me as well. And maybe, what you were saying there about...
This is where Mark Vernon might be watching my channel and looking at all the thumbnails with Dominion on it.
It's more of Protestant kind of Christianity than a Catholic kind of Christianity. Maybe that's one way into questioning his argument. So, for example, I agree that the way that this is now become so prevalent in our culture is a much more recent thing, say, since the 16th century. I actually wonder whether the seeds for the sense of human equality are actually were born really properly in the Renaissance. And for example, the famous.
Now, I thought this was a really good point, and I thought this was a really interesting point because I've been listening to Jonathan Pageau, I'm a lot more sensitive to sort of the ancient church iconography and then the Renaissance. And if you listen to The Rest is History, their episode on Poland, I've been listening to the Yale courses, Timothy Snyder's History of the Ukraine. Part of what happened is that the Cold War and the Iron Curtain sort of separated out Eastern Europe, but Eastern Europe was and Russia, in many ways they were deeply a part of Europe, and so the Renaissance is this is a period I don't think that we've really fully sort of figured out.
Famous speech by Pico della Mirandola, where the phrase "the dignity of man" is first really coined and becomes well known. So, Pico was an Italian Christian broadly, but if you read The Dignity of Man, his speech, you realize that he's drawing in actually all sorts of different traditions, particularly Jewish, Islamic, and what he would call pagan, i.e. pre-Christian traditions. And it's a kind of perennialism, really, that he is surfacing there, that he sees in many different traditions a common seed, the idea, broadly speaking, that the human is the place where the divine can be known most consciously. It's known throughout nature as well as a kind of theophany, but the human individual is the one that can consciously sort of bring their minds, their will, their desire to bear upon the realization of the divine in the world. It makes him very against things like astrology, for example, because he thinks the idea that human beings are influenced by the planets and the stars.
Now I very much recommend the preface to C.S. Lewis's treatment of 16th century literature. Lewis sort of really impacted my thoughts on astrology in the role that it played, because astrology was tremendously deterministic, and I never thought of astrology as determinism until I just had to think a little bit deeper about it. Of course it's determinism, because the course of your life is determined by the pattern of the stars, and they're just running their circuits.
Is an offense to the dignity of man, that it must spring up from within us, how we relate to the world, not just be kind of part of sort of nature. It's a sort of bit of a nature-nurture debate, I suppose. And then also, this idea of the dignity of man, the equality, and so on. I mean, Holland links it very much to the idea of the imago Dei, the image of God. And certainly in his speech and this article, he says that he talks about it as if that's written throughout the whole Bible. Whereas actually, the phrase "the image of God," human beings being made in the image of God, occurs in only one place in the Bible, which is in the first chapters of Genesis. It is used 3 times, but within the first 10 or 11 chapters of Genesis. So really only in one place. And I feel that it can't have been obvious to most of Christians until, say, the Enlightenment, seeded by the Renaissance, that human beings were equal. Because, of course, slavery continued for most of Christian history. Hierarchies shaped Christian society in the medieval period. So, the upshot for me is that whilst I agree that modern humanism is a kind of modern Christian Protestant, say, offshoot, I don't think that he can say this is something that, is kind of unique to Christianity.
Now they're going to go back and forth, and I think Sheldrake's going to come to Holland's defense. I think he's going to defend him ably, and then Mark Vernon's going to sort of pull back and get into moralism. and that's sort of where Sheldrake will come to some agreement with him. But then Sheldrake really ends strong. One of the points that they're both going to, both Sheldrake and Vernon are very interested in mysticism and the role of mystery and spirit, and so they'll both agree there. And of course, they'll have no question with Tom Holland that these are the kinds of things that have moved history throughout, and in fact has become sort of a crisis in humanism.
I don't myself see Christianity as primarily needing to be justified in terms of its morality, or even in terms of its historical effects on humanist morality. And like you, I see the main point of it as being an experience of the divine, an experience of God, that's experienced by many Christians in lots of different ways, through prayer, through worship, through thanksgiving, through singing together, through liturgies, through rituals, through pilgrimage, but I suppose above all through mystical experience, because that's the sense of direct connection with God is the underlying basis of not just Christianity, but all religions, whether you call God God or not, but a consciousness vastly greater than our own. And that, of course, is the very thing that secular humanism is against, because for them, no God exists, and humans take the place of God as the pinnacle of creation, as the ultimate consciousness in the universe. I agree. If anyone says that the principal point of Christianity is providing a moral code, then I would say that's not the principal point. Like you, I think that that's a spin-off. Jesus was proclaiming the coming of the kingdom of heaven, and that wasn't just a moral code. It was much more of spontaneously responding to the movements of the Spirit. And indeed, in the Epistle to the Hebrews and in St. Paul, there's a whole lot of going on and on about how awful the law is. I've just been reading.
Now, they're right that Christianity is far more than a moral code, but if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Morality is also a pretty integral part in it. I think it's difficult to deny.
Reading Edmund Goss's Father and Son, and he describes how when he was 6 or 7, his very, very Protestant father tried to get him to understand the Epistle to the Hebrews, and he didn't understand the concept of the law. He just thought the law was a horrible person, and he says how he kept saying, "Oh, I hate the law," because the law was being so beastly to people.
You should read C.S. Lewis's Pilgrim's Regress.
And that was a moral code, a code of behavior. So there's, in many ways, there's a lot about Christianity. It's not just about codes of behavior or doing the right, or being politically correct, and all these codes which modern secular humanism is so keen on.
Yeah, and also, to be fair to Tom Holland, on occasion I have heard him sort of reflect about his own perspective as a secular historian, and he will say that he understands that's just one perspective amongst others, and it particularly comes to the fore when you're trying to do religious history, because people that don't share the secular perspective will see the history in a completely different way. He's reflected on this in relation to Islam as well as Christianity, because he wrote a book on Islam and got into a lot of sticky water because of it, hot water because of it. But he will say that if you sort of strip out the metaphysical aspects, then the history starts to look very different. And so that, though, for me, leads to a sort of another question, which is very fascinating to ask, and I think one that's really pressing, which is, what is the model of the human that these various people claiming to speak for the human are actually using, be they atheistic humanists or be they secular scholars? Because again, that feels to me that to be very flat compared to how most humans for most of human history would have understood what it means to be human. They wouldn't have understood being human to be primarily about logic and reason, and law and rights, and kind of struggle and survival in a purely material world. They would have understood themselves to have had perceptions and experiences, as you're saying, of the mystical, the transcendent. They would have understood this life as being a preparation for a wider life. They would have understood that the divine, as well as all sorts of other non-human entities, are part of the ecology in which we live, and that taking note of all that matters quite as much as taking note of what it is to be purely human.
And if you look at the work of Clay Rutledge, you find that, I think, again, per Holland's thesis, the recession of, let's say, formal Christianity with let's say, atheism and humanism, you lead to a wilder faith, and you see that in you see it in Orthodoxy, and you certainly see it in Pentecostalism, and you see it in the fact that, as Clay Rutledge has pointed out in his psychological studies, you can read it in his book. I believe his book is titled Supernatural. People believe in all sorts of things. People believe in aliens. People believe in ghosts. People believe in... And so as modernity recedes, you have both a certain kind of Christianity and this kind of atheism and humanism all receding together.
In the modern sense. And, for me, this points to, in a way, a crisis in the humanities, which is a bit like actually what it reminded me a bit of what Mary Midgley used to say about the life sciences. That, and I know you've thought this too, that that the irony of the life sciences, so called, is they often strip out the bit that's actually to do most with life.
And of course, this is a point that Paul Kingsnorth has been making pretty strenuously.
And similarly, it seems to me that the humanities strip out much of what it actually has meant to be human in order to tell their histories of, who's up, who's down, or claim their rather narrow set of values and rights. So his intervention, insofar as people feel or not even notice that he's made this intervention, it does raise a much bigger question as well.
Well, I agree. I mean, for the vast majority of humanity in the past, and indeed the vast majority of humanity today, being human includes God, gods, angels, spirits, ancestors, as living presences in their lives, holy places, rituals, the importance of Thanksgiving, the importance of festivals and ceremonies, the importance of rites of passage for birth, marriage, and death, at the very least. Now, these even secular humanists now have ministers who deal with rites of passage. They have to admit these are important. But the fact is, the great majority of humans, and the great majority of humanity as actually experienced by humans, is about and very closely linked to that which is more than human, namely the natural world, the divine, the spiritual realm, and so on. And being human is part of all that. It's not being human with all that stripped away and cancelled out. And so the number of people who actually share in this secular human nature, even today, is a tiny minority. As Tom Holland points out, humanist congresses, nearly all of them have been in Western Europe, North America, or Australia.
And they are declining, even in the UK. This is Holland's point, and this, I think, is the point that all of modernity is receding.
And the great majority of people who attend them are white, and probably mostly ex-Protestant, or so. This view of humanity is actually a minority view even today. And in this recent census that showed that...
I think, before he gets to the census, I think he's being a little easy on the Orthodox and the Catholic, because they've done plenty of nominalists declining into modernity too. It's just they acted humanist, and they sort of skipped the Protestant stage.
That Christians are only 49% of the British population or something like that. And that a substantial number of people, I've forgotten what, something like, is it 30% or something, describe themselves as non-religious. That doesn't mean they're all atheists. In fact, they're probably only a minority are atheists. There are very many people now in Britain.
And again, Holland's point is the number of atheists declined too.
And increasingly in the US, who call themselves spiritual but not religious, and whose vision of humanity still includes spiritual realms and experiences which are not part of the secular humanist atheist map. So it's very much a minority view, even in Britain today, which is pretty godless culture, but even here it's a minority view. And yet it's been put out as if this is the view of human nature that should dominate all international institutions, United Nations policies and everything else, and government policies and educational policies. So it is actually a remarkable triumph of
Now, I'm not going to do it in this video because I'm out of time, but catch on The Rest is History their episode on Senegal. And by all means, okay, Tom and Dom, I'm carrying your water for you. I love you guys. I have absolutely no problem promoting the heck out of your podcast because I think it's one of the best podcasts around. In that same live stream that they did last Wednesday, they go deeper into the Senegal podcast, where in many respects they note that this one island that became very popular in the wave of Roots, Roots, the book, Alex Haley's book in the United States, African American rising of consciousness and in fact affluence. So you can have African American tourism to this little island off the coast of Senegal. In many ways, the United Nations, look at the Declaration of Human Rights in 1949, World Heritage Foundation. In some ways, the United Nations became the mainline church, complete with pilgrimage sites, their Declaration of Human Rights. And unlike Protestant churches haven't had armies, Protestant nations surely have had armies. Catholic nations have had armies, and of course the United Nations, in some ways seeing the United Nations as the fulfillment of the mainline churches that sort of peaked into secularism and all the way over. Now Sheldrake's really going to finish this strong, so I want to end it. I want to get all the way there.
Evangelical colonization of the media and the educational policies. So it is actually a remarkable triumph of evangelical colonization of the media and the educational institutions that a minority position has actually managed to create a culture where this is taken to be by many people the norm, and as if it's always been the norm except when corrupted by Christianity.
Yeah, I suppose that there's history of post-Reformation war in Europe and all that. People argue whether they're really religious wars or not, but with the birth of the nation state and so that kind of echoes around in people's suspicions of Christianity. But to use another word that is often banded around today, this colonization of the past with secular assumptions. I hope it's beginning to swing the other way, actually, partly because
and again, I think this is what Holland is saying the survey is indicative of.
As you say, although people may not identify with any particular religion, that's far from saying they're automatically atheists, and quite the opposite. And so it feels to me that there's a kind of pressure, or maybe not a pressure, but at least potentially a really sort of receptivity towards the idea of expanding the human again. And the past then can become a real resource for imagining that, because we can look at what people knew before not to go back, but to re-engage with that, with the assumptions and the sense of being human that we have now, which feels to me it's going to be increasingly crucial, partly because of ecological crises, but also just more immediately because of the sort of dearth of the imagination around what it means to be human, and all the problems that arises for people, mental health, otherwise. It feels this
meaning crisis
all kind of connects together somehow, an enrichment, a rewilding of the human. We've talked.
He's singing King's North Song, but he's not doing it from the Orthodox Church, and that's where you sort of see these, as Peter Lindbergh would talk about, these mimetic tribes, and the mimetic tribes that are reasserting themselves with the recession of modernity. And again, in England, that's a recession of people who say identify with the Church of England, but also identify as humanist or atheist. And so this spiritual but not religion is in many ways sort of a rewilding. Lewis wrote about this, and Lewis sort of welcomed it with, of course, Mark Vernon had a very interesting conversation with someone on Lewis recently, which was a really fascinating conversation too. Again, I can only make so many videos, and there's so much stuff being brought out that is worth talking about, that's worth having videos made about it. So yeah, all of these, I'm obviously not going to put a link to the Rest is History live stream. Join the Rest is History Club. Join the live stream. It's great. You won't be disappointed. Rest is History Club is a lot cheaper than Daily Wire Plus. But I'll leave the link to this video. And you might also then look at Jordan Peterson's conversation with Matt Ridley, because they touched on this, and I really want to give that video more attention, because that was really an outstanding section. And of course, Matt Ridley, another somebody else from the UK with, well, maybe the kind of religion we need is the Church of England. My friend, it's going away. So anyway, let me know what you think. Leave a comment.